Good day, everybody, and welcome to another edition of the Military and Foreign Affairs Network. I am your host, the voice of reason. Today, we are continuing our ongoing coverage of the war between the Russian Federation and Ukraine. So there has been a lot of talk, a lot of discussion about a hypothetical war between the North Atlantic Treaty Organization and the Russian Federation. Is that possible? Could we see an all-out war between Western nation states, NATO, i.e. Poland, Germany, the United States, France, the United Kingdom, against the Russian Federation? I think we could. I believe at this point the narrative is being shaped by the North Atlantic Treaty Organization to step by step find a way to engage in overt rather than covert hostilities against Russian forces. I think at this point, especially in regards to Ukraine, that NATO leadership, namely in the United States, the United Kingdom, are aware that the likelihood of a successful outcome of the Ukrainian-Russian war will end in a victory for the Ukrainians without the assistance of air power. Now, could the Ukrainians be handed aircraft, F-16s, Gripens, Mirage 2000s, tornadoes? Possibly. But at the end of the day, what would that outcome look like? Would the Russians still maintain air supremacy, especially near the line of contact, near the front lines? And that's where the Russians are winning in terms of using its fixed-wing aircraft against Ukrainian forces. The Ukrainians would not be delivered enough aircraft to really make a difference. And at the end of the day, those aircraft, those F-16s, those Gripens, those tornadoes, would have to fly at altitude in order to engage Russian aircraft, in which they would then be engaged by long-range Russian air defense systems, and obviously Russian aircraft as well. And would that be successful? Probably not. Probably not. So then what happens if we were to see an all-out conflict that NATO finally intervenes on behalf of Ukraine? Be it because of a nuclear incident that takes place at Ernhodar, or something else were to occur. The narrative right now appears to be shaping around the nuclear power plant on the eastern bank of the Dnieper River, the left bank of the Dnieper River. Now, I've heard discussion in the comment section that NATO, quote-unquote, would defeat Russia in weeks. And I believe that at least here in the United States, based on what a lot of people have observed in terms of this ongoing conflict with the Ukrainians, that the Russian military is perceived as weak, as incompetent, and thus if the overwhelming power of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization in terms of air power were to be arrayed against the Russian Federation, that the conflict would be over in weeks. Now, obviously, ground forces would also have to be introduced into this conflict. What would that look like? I think at this point, it's safe to say that you would see Polish forces, that you could see elements of the United Kingdom involved in this conflict. I think you could see forces from the Baltic states, although very small, be deployed. But I think at this point, the narrative is being shaped to have the Poles bear the brunt of this conflict on the ground. I don't believe we will see French forces. I do not believe we will see German forces. That would be a hoot to see Germans fighting in eastern Ukraine. But who knows? I don't think at the beginning of this conflict we would have seen or foreseen attacks against Moscow, attacks deep inside of Russia, or the handover of some of the most advanced weapon systems NATO has to offer to the Ukrainians. Brimstone, Storm Shadows, Challenger 2 main battle tanks, M1 Abrams, everything is being handed over. And over the last month, it has proved essentially futile. So the Ukrainians have to have an air force. But would it be over in weeks? Would this NATO operation last weeks and then the Russians capitulate? And therein lies the issue of this conflict. People in the West have this idea that a war between Russia and its allies would take weeks. The Russians are prepared to fight for years. Look at World War II. You can say World War II is essentially ancient history in terms of modern war. But you have to look at it. You have to analyze it. You have to analyze the fact that many analysts during World War II, many generals, believed that the Soviets, the Russians, were going to be defeated, especially early in the conflict, 1941, when vast Soviet armies were enveloped and then destroyed by German forces. Hundreds of thousands of Russian prisoners, Soviet prisoners, were taken in these operations, and the Germans had gotten within sight of Moscow. But the Russians did not stop fighting. And ultimately, victory on the part of Allied forces is the direct result of the Russian/Soviet cost. So when you say that a war between Russia and NATO would last for weeks, where are you getting that from? Where is that coming from? Why do you believe that? Because what if it doesn't? What if it doesn't? And at the end of the day, in all probability, a large-scale conflict between NATO and Russia would start World War III. The conflict would expand into the oceans, into areas we have not seen war within the scope of this conflict. But I think at the beginning of this conflict, we would see, namely, Polish forces, other nation states involved directly in the conflict. I think in terms of air power, we would see the United States directly participate. We would see the United Kingdom directly participate. Not sure about the Germans, unsure of the French. But we would definitely see the UK, the United States, and Poland fighting the Russians. And then it would continue to evolve and expand from there. But would it last weeks? Absolutely not. We would be in a war for years. And then ultimately the question with China and other Russian allies coming to the aid of Russia, and does the conflict further expand? Do we see a war between Taiwan and China? Do we see a Chinese blockade of Taiwan while the United States is tied up in a war with the Russian Federation. So ultimately, who wins if the United States and Russia go to war over Ukraine? It's going to be the Chinese. Chinese will be the ultimate winners in this conflict for a number of reasons. A number of reasons. But at this point, the Ukrainian military, for all that they are talking about in terms of what's happening on the ground right now, this gradual war of attrition in which the Ukrainians are trying to shape the narrative right now that they are taking territory and they are winning. Are they moving forward a little bit? Yeah, they are. But that those territorial gains are in the hundreds and thousands of meters. Hundreds of meters per day. And no main line of Russian defensive lines has yet to be breached by the Ukrainian forces. At all. And you can see it here. You can see the areas where the Ukrainians have moved forward and taken areas. And we continue to see very heavy fighting taking place near Bakhmut and other areas such as Avdiivka as well. The Russians are on the offensive in some of these areas. We zoom into Bakhmut, we can kind of see exactly what's happening. Again, just to the north, I mean, essentially nothing has changed. The Russians are perfectly happy striking at the Ukrainian front lines with its artillery and aircraft. We know over the course of the last month, since early June, since the start of the Ukrainian counteroffensive, that because of rear area strikes by Russian cruise missiles, Iskander missiles, modified S-300s, probably more Ukrainian officers, leadership members of the Ukrainian military have been killed or wounded over the last 30 days than at any point in the conflict. I would imagine that because of the offensive in the south, the failed offensive in the south, the Ukrainians probably sustained more casualties than at any point in the conflict. And we're, again, hearing talks about another surge of Ukrainian forces in the south, towards Zaporizhia, towards south of Orikhiv, near Volhodar, west of Volhodar. And again, the goal, well, the original goal of Ukrainian forces was a drive towards Melitopol, and thus breaking the land corridor between Russia proper and the Crimea, and not even close. And I think at this point, it's probably has been written off by the Ukrainian High Command, the Ukrainian General Staff, in terms of achieving any of those objectives. Because again, the Russian army is continuing to build up, to get stronger. Its military-industrial complex is continuing to ramp up. You hear the narrative in the West that Russia doesn't have the capacity to build its own tanks, that it doesn't have the capacity to build its own guided missile systems, to build its own multiple launch rocket system, its own rockets. So what is the thought process behind that? I mean, during the Soviet times, the Russians, built thousands and thousands and thousands of tanks. And the Russians have the ability to garner supplies from the Chinese, from other nation states. And they're building their own stuff as well. So again, I think it's another false narrative that unfortunately we're hearing in this conflict. And that's kind of where we set for today. Again, I would bid you caution if you really believe that a war between NATO and Russia would last just for weeks. That victory by NATO would be achieved in weeks. You're mistaken. Seriously mistaken. And at the end of the day, the war would expand. It would affect, here in the United States, your way of life. And it would affect you in ways that you have not thought about yet. But it would. Absolutely. So that's where we are. We will continue to analyze. We will continue to report. Thank you for joining us today. And as always, have a good day and avoid the turbulence.